PaxTube is your typical Catholic channel of far-right ideas. Some like the defense of Putin's politics, the characteristic criticism of modernity, and of course, the defense of the Confederate States of America. One of PaxTube's videos is a, so to speak, rebuttal of a video by the Atun Shei Films channel. This channel spends a lot of time refuting the lost cause myth, which dictates that the CSA did not fight for slavery, but for states' rights. This narrative was refuted, and is still being debunked by many professional historians. It is only small conservative circles who still promote it. Obviously, with the purpose of countering the woke narrative in favor of union and the abolition of slavery. For anyone who has seen Atun Shei's videos, you know that the things PaxTube said have already been refuted by him. However, I want to add my 2 cents, and rebut the PaxTube video myself. Before I begin, I want to clarify that I am not a professional or an academic of history. I am just an amateur trying to refute a bad video that defends a nation that objectively separated because of slavery. This video may possibly have errors, things that will age badly, and don't expect a super elaborate bibliography, but it is my contribution to the subject. With that said, let's begin. All sources will be in the description.
Over 150 years ago, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to the Union at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the American Civil War. The Confederate States of America dissolved not long after, and the American South was once again brought under the jurisdiction of the United States government. You might think that a 150-year-old conflict wouldn't be a source of cultural tension today, and until relatively recently, that was the case. The United States has, for over a century, gone out of its way to honor the Confederate dead, whether it be granting citizenship to the late Robert E. Lee, or granting the families of fallen Confederate soldiers the same benefits as U.S. veterans. This was normal as late as the early 2000s. However, in recent years, the American Civil War has re-entered the political landscape in a big way. This has come in the form of attempts to remove Confederate monuments from the public square. In many cases, these monuments have stood without issue for over 100 years. It seems strange that there is more hatred towards Confederates today than there was in the post-war period, including from people who had literally fought against them. The source of this renewed hostility is obvious: changing demographics and culture in the United States. As white Americans move towards becoming a minority due to mass immigration from the entire world, respect for white American history is also being ousted.
Like most of people who think like PaxTube, they are afraid of demographic change in favor of minorities. However, this is not the source of the hatred towards the CSA. The key reason why the CSA is so hated these days is because it was founded on slavery. This is in various secession documents, in public statements, and other official documents. Not to mention how the American right has transformed the Confederacy, and especially the battle flag, into a racist symbol against minorities. And I say this as a conservative myself. Those are the real reasons for why the Confederacy became so hated.
Confederates are the first targets in the crosshairs. Due to their direct association with slavery, they're soft targets for attack indeed, as many people would rather throw their hands up in submission than defend these controversial figures. However, I'm not the type to surrender so easily. That brings us to the subject at hand. One advocate for removing Confederate monuments is the self-proclaimed history channel Atun Shei Films.
I find it ironic how PaxTube calls Atun Shei a self-proclaimed history channel when 1. Atun Shei leaves sources on most of his videos, which PaxTube rarely does. And 2. PaxTube calls himself a social critique, a YouTube voice of reason.
This channel devotes a large amount of focus to the Confederacy, primarily working to demonize them. At the start of the George Floyd riots this summer, the channel released a video titled "You're Probably Wrong About Confederate Monuments," where the creator puts forward perhaps the strongest arguments that anti-monument advocates have.
If you've seen many of my videos, it'll come as no surprise to you that I'm in favor of removing Confederate monuments from public spaces.
So to rebut the pro-removal movement, I'll be providing counter-arguments to their strongest points. So let's dive in. His video begins with a rather bizarre explanation for how he supposedly went from being for keeping monuments to now being for removing them.
I used to be pretty staunchly opposed to the removal of Confederate statues, but living through the monument controversy here in New Orleans in 2017 changed my opinion.
This is all he says in regards to his change. It's rather unclear why two sides brawling over a monument would make you change your opinion about keeping one. While it does demonstrate there are those passionate for removal, it equally shows there are those passionate for protection. It's interesting that he calls pro-monument groups out-of-town agitators and anti-monument groups locals, because this statement is hardly backed by evidence. One of the most influential groups pushing for Confederate monuments to be removed is Black Lives Matter. This group has a tremendous amount of nationwide funding and influence. They use this funding and influence to organize many anti-Confederate protests throughout the country.
I wonder how being against a nation that arbitrarily separated for a despicable reason like slavery, and is defended by a bunch of racists and far-right weirdos is bad.
If there were indeed out-of-town agitators in Atun Shei Films' hometown, they were at best on both sides. I also want to quickly address the thumbnail of his video. Flipping off the bust of a person who's been dead over 100 years? Stunning and brave, we're all very impressed. Now let's get to his arguments, which he presents by responding to pro-monument arguments.
A few moments later.
He goes on to give several other examples of monuments being removed by local officials. This point falls flat for several reasons. Firstly, to suggest that something happening locally can't be part of a coordinated top-down effort is simply ridiculous. We live in the information age. Propaganda is distributed to the population en masse via the internet, television, mandatory schooling, etc. The corporate media, or mainstream media, is especially effective at forming public opinion. Indeed, one of the very reasons that people want to tear Confederate monuments down is due to the messages being given by the mainstream media. If not for this media, this entire controversy would be far less significant. Furthermore, there's nothing stopping local officials from receiving marching orders from a higher authority. Elected officials are part of political parties, and political parties coordinate. They also have donors and special interests who they work to please.
PaxTube, like most right-wingers, proceeds to blame the evil mainstream media for the fact that their defunct racist nation that they now defend is being rightly demonized. As I've shown before, the Confederacy of course fought for the preservation of slavery. Any attempt to deny this fact has already been refuted by most historians, and the tendency to be against it has been increasing in recent years. The sheer number of videos and articles debunking the Confederacy is proof of this. But of course, for these people anything that portrays the Confederacy as the bad guy in history is obviously anti-white propaganda.
To put it plainly, the idea that people now want to remove Confederate monuments out of some new organic, grassroots awakening is the furthest thing from the truth.
12 seconds later.
The reason these statues are under attack isn't simply because they were Confederates. It's that they were white people who put their own race first.
Put your race first. That slogan is very popular among far-rightists who make an apology for their racism. Also, PaxTube could have perfectly said that they put their state first, or their family, or even their faith, but interestingly, he chose race.
Historical interpretation. The Civil War from the Southern point of view.
12 seconds later.
So here he's invoking the lost cause narrative. A narrative that he and several other historians consider a historical campaign to whitewash the Confederacy. But when analyzing this supposed narrative, that Atun Shei states is well documented, we immediately run into problems. What counts as whitewashing the Confederacy? Is it something as simple as not portraying them as evil mustache-twirling villains?
I will put some quotes from Southern and Confederate leaders and you will judge for yourself if they sound like villains. The slave trade, however, so far as the African was concerned, was a blessing. It brought him from abject slavery and a barbarian master, and sold him into a Christian land. The slave trade has been the greatest source of permanent blessing to him. Jefferson Davis, President of the CSA. Slavery, the very source of our existence, the greatest blessing both for master and slave that could have been bestowed upon us. Stephen D. Ramseur, future Confederate general. I want Cuba. I want Tamaulipas, Potosi, and one or two other Mexican states, and I want them all for the same reason, for the planting and spreading of slavery. I would spread the blessings of slavery, like the religion of our divine master, to the uttermost ends of the earth. Mr. President, it seems to me that Northern senators most pertinaciously overlook the main point at issue between the two sections of our Confederacy. We claim that there is property in slaves, and they deny it. Albert Gallatin Brown, Senator from Mississippi. The South is invaded. It is time for all patriots to be united, to be under military organization, to be advancing to the conflict determined to live or die in defense of the God-given right to own the African. Richard Archer, Southern planter. Democratic liberty exists solely because we have slaves. Freedom is not possible without slavery. Article from the Southern newspaper Richmond Inquirer. There is not a respectable system of civilization known to history whose foundations were not laid in the institution of domestic slavery. Robert Hunter, Southern senator. We regard every man in our midst an enemy to the institutions of the South, who does not boldly declare that he believes African slavery to be a social, moral, and political blessing. From the Southern newspaper Atlantic Confederacy. African slavery is the cornerstone of the industrial, social, and political fabric of the South. And whatever wars against it, wars against its very existence. Strike down the institution of African slavery and you reduce the South to depopulation and barbarism. The anti-slavery party contends that slavery is wrong in itself, and the government is a consolidated national democracy. We of the South contend that slavery is right, and that this is a Confederate republic of sovereign states. Lawrence Keat, Southern senator. I don't know what you may think, but to me the intentions of these men are very clear.
Is it whitewashing to say that any of their viewpoints were justified? Is it whitewashing to accurately attribute the causes of the war to not just slavery, but a variety of issues, including federal tariffs on goods that were critical to the Southern economy?
Let's look at each of the points and I'll show how they were related to slavery. First, the Electoral College in favor of the North. Many Confederacy apologists say that the Electoral College was designed to favor the North. But did you know that the Electoral College actually was born in to benefit the slave-owning South? Since the Southern states would be at a disadvantage due to their smaller voting population, the future Confederacy sought to establish an election method that would take advantage of the 3/5 compromise. In the long run, this would allow the South to accommodate the government to its interests. Examples include the Fugitive Slave Act, or the removal of Indians to Oklahoma, or the fact that many Southern planters supported the Mexican-American War and the Walker's filibuster campaigns, just to have more territory to take slavery to. Oh please, even after abolition, the Southern states did everything to prevent their black population from voting, because they knew it would definitely end the Confederacy. Furthermore, in the long run, Southern racism would spread throughout the United States, thus giving rise to the KKK. Next is the tariffs. While it is true that some tariffs affected the Southern economy in favor of the North, these occupied a secondary place within the motives of the secessionists. An example of this is the Morrill Tariff, which many neo-Confederates use as proof that the war was caused by tariffs. This is false, since in speeches and newspapers, mentions of this law were quite peripheral because these speeches emphasized slavery. In addition, 7 of the states seceded before its passage. Another problem with the use of the Morrill Tariff is that it ignores the fact that the Southern senators had resigned, and by simple logic, since there was no one to reject its approval, it was approved by Congress. Nevertheless, if they had remained there, they would have had enough votes for the law not to have been approved. In simple words, the Morrill Act was a result and not a cause of the war. Another example is the nullification crisis, used by Confederate apologists to sustain this myth. However, this ignores that it happened about 30 years earlier, so the political landscape was not the same. There is actually very little documentation that credits tariffs as a cause of the war, at least independently, in contrast to slavery, which is constantly mentioned. Even Lawrence Keat, at the South Carolina Secessionist Assembly, made this clear. But the tariff is not the question which brought the people up to their present attitude. We are to give a summary of our causes to the world, but mainly to the other Southern states, whose co-action we wish, and we must not make a fight on the tariff question. In fact, Atun Shei has a video talking about this point, and it effectively shows that New York alone paid more taxes than all the other American ports combined. Watch his video, it is highly recommended. Final point. Centralization versus decentralization. Contrary to what many Southern apologists believe, the Confederacy was a centralized and undemocratic state. Examples include the Confederacy suspending habeas corpus twice, or conscription acts, or arbitrary arrests of questionable legitimacy. There is enough evidence to doubt that decentralization was part of the Confederate agenda, not to mention that Southern states had no qualms about using the power of the central government to enforce laws like the Fugitive Slave Act. There is no way that the Confederacy was seeking a libertarian government, or even worse, they wanted freedom, but for oppress others.
Keep in mind that the South at the time had the fourth largest economy in the world. While slavery was certainly a key issue in this rivalry, it was not the only issue, and other factors should not be overlooked or downplayed. The Confederates saw their states as part of the Union conditionally, the condition being that they feel adequately represented in the federal government. By the time of the Civil War, they had all concluded this condition was broken, and they resolved to end their involvement in the United States as a result. This brought up a constitutional issue that still, to this very day, has not been fully resolved. Was the United States intended to keep states that joined it within it forever? The Confederates said no, the Union said yes, and this was the true cause of the war.
Of course, we're going to ignore all the evidence and the consensus among historians that slavery was the major cause of the war. Also, do you honestly believe that if any Confederate state had wanted to separate from the Confederacy would not have invaded it? You only have to read the Confederate Constitution and know how many powers the Confederate Congress had to know that thing of states' rights is a lie.
Armies weren't mustered to invade the South over Southern states owning slaves. They were done so over Southern states seceding. This is indisputable fact, not a myth. What people like Atun Shei Films call the Lost Cause myth is so broad it could encompass essentially any unbiased review of the Civil War. He wants to replace non-existent propaganda with his propaganda.
In fact, the Lost Cause myth did arise because of propaganda. Women's and veterans associations promoted pro-Southern stories, just as pro-Confederate literature arose. A good example is Edward Pollard's book The Lost Cause, which is probably where the term arose. Many of these veterans meant to eliminate Northern misconceptions, and they tended to remark its positive qualities and deify figures like Jefferson Davis. Simply put, the Lost Cause became a cult for the South.
It began as a post-war effort to try and justify secession.
10 seconds later.
Atun Shei Films never actually goes into detail about what the Lost Cause actually means. He states the Southern Historical Society papers whitewash slavery, but no further detail is given. He draws zero distinction between what constitutes a legitimate historical count of the Civil War from the Confederate perspective and a, as he puts it, pro-Confederate editorial. Like many who harp about a supposed lost cause narrative being spread, he is vague on purpose. To people like Atun Shei Films, any historical review of the Civil War that doesn't paint Confederates as mindless monsters is pro-Confederate propaganda. But the inverse is true. To oversimplify the Confederate point of view is the fabrication.
To answer this point, I'll go step by step. First, the Southern Historical Society papers, according to modern historians, was in charge of distributing pro-Confederate articles. That is a consensus of modern historiography. Second, as I already mentioned, the Lost Cause was born from pro-Confederate propaganda. You only have to look at what the leaders and people of the South said before and compare it with what they said after. That change from, "we fought for slavery," to, "we actually fought for states' rights," was driven by the desire not to be remembered as the monsters they were. Finally, regarding the Confederate point of view, look at the secession documents or the speeches given by the leaders and then tell me what that point of view was.
Let's move to his next point, where he claims that the true intention behind Confederate monuments was to intimidate black people.
2,000 years later.
These groups gave many different reasons for erecting the monuments, and not one stated reason had anything to do with intimidating anyone. And here's why. The true purpose behind most Confederate monuments was Southern pride. Pride, respect, and kinship with a unique Southern people that developed over centuries. Not anti-blackness, not being pro-slavery, not being anti-American, but to be pro-South.
I'm not going to deny that perhaps some of these monuments were in favor of the South and without racist ideas, since during the Civil War practically every family in the South suffered some loss and looked for something to mourn. However, what PaxTube has said ignores a lot of things. For example, the fact that most of these monuments were erected in the Jim Crow era, when numerous laws were passed against African American citizens. Or Stone Mountain in Georgia, which honors 3 Southern generals, is on the land of a KKK member. Or that several of the monument booms arose in reaction to legal victories for African Americans. The creation of several of these monuments has roots in the South's reaction to black rights. A fairly basic investigation is enough to discover that these monuments were created to perpetuate the lost cause, or to enforce white supremacy within the territories of the former Confederacy. In fact, in North Carolina, between 1865 and 1890, only 30 monuments were erected. Do you want to know how many were in the Jim Crow era? More than 130. Speaking of monument dedications, we have records of several dedications emphasizing racism. For example, at the dedication of Silent Sam in 1913 in North Carolina, an industrialist named Julian Carr urged his audience to maintenance of white supremacy with the same vigor that their Confederate ancestors had defended slavery. And in fact, before finishing the point, anger against the glorification of the CSA is not something new, since during the post-war period, Northern and African-descended veterans were very upset by the actions of the first lost causers.
This is obvious upon listening to any of the many different dedication speeches for these monuments.
10 seconds later.
You see, in the past, your value as a person wasn't determined by how anti-racist or anti-sexist you were. It was determined by one's virtues and duty to their people. Confederates like Robert E. Lee are honored for their duty to the South, and also, in the case of Lee, for his impeccable personal character. Racism today is effectively a smear word, used especially against white people who care about their own race. That was certainly the case for people who built Confederate statues. But of course, it was also the case for the people who built the United States itself. Even the Union that fought against the Confederacy would today be considered racist, as many of their plans for freed slaves was to send them back to Africa. This policy was known as repatriation.
This is definitely one of the biggest idiocies he's ever said. First, he makes the mistake of comparing the Confederacy to the original 13 states. Why is this wrong? Because while the 13 states were founded on liberal Enlightenment ideas, the Confederacy was founded on slavery. That's something that's super obvious at this level. Even if the original 13 states were racist, they were fighting for a totally different cause than the Confederacy, which was fighting to maintain slavery. Second, even if the Union was racist, it wasn't the one fighting for slavery. Repatriation to Africa, while indeed racist, was a pretty anti-slavery position for the time and was supported by many abolitionists. So yes, it was racist, but not on the level of the Confederacy.
The last thing I'll say on this is that those tearing down Confederate monuments make zero distinction between what they believe the intentions of the statues was. Take, for example, Silent Sam, torn down by a mob in 2017. This statue was simply dedicated to the nameless Confederate war dead and had nothing to do with glorifying slavery. Did that matter to the mob that tore it down? No. Because, like most lobbying to tear down monuments, they're animated by anti-white animus, not some nuanced historical viewpoint.
This is the monument I was talking about earlier, and it's obvious that PaxTube didn't do enough research. As I said before, Julian Carr made a racist dedication, and I quote, "I trust I may be pardoned for one allusion. Howbeit it is rather personal. 100 yards from where we stood, on Franklin Street, less than 90 days perhaps after my return from Appomattox, I horse-whipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds, because upon the streets of this quiet village she had publicly insulted an evil Southern lady, and then rushed for protection to these university buildings where a garrison of 100 Federal soldiers was stationed. I performed the pleasing duty in the immediate presence of the entire garrison, and for 30 nights afterward slept with a double-barrel shotgun under my head." The history of Silent Sam, and most Confederate monuments, is steeped in racism, and anyone who tries to deny this fact is probably lying. Efforts to remove it are not new, and date back to the second half of the 20th century. Please, he even got the purpose of the monument wrong. It was not to honor nameless Confederates, but the university students who left their books for guns. Come on, he couldn't even get that right.
We're not erasing history by taking down Confederate monuments. We're course correcting.
10 seconds later.
Like I said, for those like Atun Shei Films, this is not about erasing history, it's about rewriting it from their viewpoint.
Later.
While monuments should be used to help people remember their history, those in favor of removal want them specifically remembered in as negative a light as possible. Two very different things.
The next Christmas.
When someone like Atun Shei Films suggests moving these monuments to museums, what they're actually imagining is essentially a tightly controlled public pillory, one where Confederates can be totally demonized and have their worst aspects highlighted.
If you have a criminal who illegally tried to break the Constitution and then fought for slavery, what do? I can quote more Confederates to show that they were indeed the villains of the Civil War. The General Assembly shall have no power to pass laws for the emancipation of slaves. Georgia Constitution of 1861. What did we go to war for, if not to protect our property? Robert Hunter, Senator from Virginia.
A public monument leaves historical interpretation up for the viewer to decide for themselves. Museums, by contrast, tell viewers exactly how to think. And boy, do the pro-removal crowd want to tell people how to think about white people and American history.
I'm sure PaxTube doesn't understand why there are people who advocate moving this to a museum dedicated to slavery. People like PaxTube think that condemning slavery is equivalent to being a person who hates white people. But this is incorrect, because when we talk about slavery, in this case, American slavery, we are not talking about white people or black people, but about the system and how it was perpetuated. A museum dedicated to slavery will not say, white people bad, or America bad, but slavery bad, because that is the point of a slavery museum.
Atun Shei Films actually directly confirms this himself a few sentences later.
1 million, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion times later.
Confederate soldiers were American soldiers. Whatever evil they did, they still deserve to be honored for their service and sacrifice.
Do they, though?
Yes.
Confederates were Americans, but they didn't fight for America.
7 months later.
The United States was founded on principles of the Enlightenment, liberal democracy, personal liberty, equality for all, even if, for a lot of Americans, those ideals were, and are, a sick joke.
Well, so which is it? Does America value democracy or does it not? This guy is talking out of both sides of his mouth. In reality, the true principle that America was founded upon was self-government.
Let's look at the United States Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Let's look at the preamble to the Constitution. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Let's look at the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Let's look at quotes from the Founding Fathers. It will be worthy of a free, enlightened, and, at no distant period, a great nation, to give to mankind the magnanimous and too novel example of a people always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence. Be it remembered, that liberty must at all hazards be supported. We have a right to it, derived from our Maker. But if we have not, our fathers have earned and bought it for us at the expense of their ease, their estates, their pleasure, and their blood. In Europe, charters of liberty have been granted by power. America has set the example, of charters of power granted by liberty. This revolution in the practice of the world, may, with an honest praise, be pronounced the most triumphant epoch of its history, and the most consoling presage of its happiness. At this point I think it's pretty obvious that America was indeed founded on Enlightenment principles. It may or may not respect them, but that's another matter. And I hope I'm not the only one who thinks PaxTube is hypocritical in criticizing simplification of the Confederate point of view with slavery, when he does exactly the same thing by saying that the true principle on which America was founded is self-government.
Something the Confederacy was attempting to do. This is precisely why the Confederates saw themselves as the true Americans.
While this is partially true, it comes with nuances. In the pre-war period, the South made efforts to distinguish itself from the North. Elements such as deep religiosity or politics were something with which they distinguished themselves from the Union. While it is true that many Confederates, before the war, were loyal to the Union, this was under the condition of white supremacy. Southern politicians used the government to uphold their racial ideals as law. It wasn't until Abraham Lincoln was elected that this loyalty was broken and the South seceded. In simple words, The Southerners were not loyal to the United States, but to the racial ideas of slavery and white supremacy. Hell, the more I research, the more I hate the Confederacy.
The Confederacy didn't stand for American values. It stood for might makes right.
2 seconds later.
Someone should probably let Atun Shei Films know that the United States was born from a revolution. How is what the Confederacy did might makes right, but not what the United States did during its founding? The truth is, neither are. Both had nuanced moral justifications for what they were doing. No one ever said, we're strong, you're weak, therefore we're right. That is the definition of a straw man argument. The truth is, nothing Atun Shei Films is saying here is based on fact. This is simply his own modern, personal interpretation of history. And though it should be obvious, don't make the mistake of thinking he's some kind of American nationalist. Just listen to what he says next about United States history.
There's a lot to be ashamed of in American history. Slavery, Native American genocide, the Monroe Doctrine, Manifest Destiny, the Mexican War, Vietnam, Iraq, white supremacy, the list goes on.
I too think there are things that America should be ashamed of, but they're not events from over 100 years ago.
To what extent did PaxTube go so far as to want to manipulate the discourse to the point that it conveniently left out the fragment where Atun Shei says that there are things that the US can be proud of?
There's a lot to be ashamed of in American history. Slavery, Native American genocide, the Monroe Doctrine, Manifest Destiny, the Mexican War, Vietnam, Iraq, white supremacy, the list goes on. But there's a lot to be proud of, too. A lot of things to celebrate. And the cause of the Union during the Civil War is one of them.
There are things that are happening right now, like being the pornography capital of the world, or having hundreds of thousands of abortions every year.
I agree that those things are bad, but talking about them in a video about slavery and the CSA is just diverting attention from the entire point of the discussion. If that doesn't sound like a fallacy, like the straw man PaxTube mentioned earlier, then I don't know what is, but I'm sure there's something wrong there.
It's very, very telling that Atun Shei Films wants us to focus on slavery, which was ended 150 years ago. This is what happens when the only basis of your worldview is being anti-white. Let's get to the final part of the video, where he chastises historians for not being anti-racist enough and not more strongly enforcing his anti-white version of history.
Now look, taking these statues down isn't going to magically solve racism. No one thing ever will. But does that mean that we, as historians and students of history, shouldn't even try? Taking a look, honest look at darker aspects of our past can inform us about things that we're dealing with today. It's easy to talk about how the Battle of Waterloo or the 30 Years' War shaped the modern world. It's a lot less comfortable and more challenging to talk about how slavery or indigenous genocide did. But that's a much more productive conversation to have. Get out of your comfort zone, history nerds.
I don't know where this guy has been for the last 60 years, but the American university system is already dominated by people with exactly the worldview he's espousing. There are entire college majors for indigenous studies, genocide studies, and critical race theory. And everything we are seeing today are the effects of this. Contrary to being productive, Atun Shei Films' view that we should connect all racial problems today back to slavery is destructive. It creates a framework where white people are seen as the villains of history, which modern white people should be ashamed of, and other groups are encouraged to get even with. Where this anti-European narrative is leading and has led in the past is dangerous. And we should ask ourselves if Atun Shei Films and the academics that agree with him want it that way.
There's a lot to say about this, so let's go part by part. Maybe it's just the right view. In my experience researching these things, I found that history tends to be worse than you might imagine. Not the pretty story that people like PaxTube want to push, but a series of complex events that, in the case of negative things like slavery or indigenous genocide, is worse than we think. You may not believe it, but several problems of racism can be linked to slavery. The oppression suffered by African descendants by the government led to systemic racism and Jim Crow, which inevitably ended in the current difficult situation. Saying that racism has nothing to do with slavery is a big mistake. This is the only point where I will agree with him, but partially, since, who were the owners of the slaves? The resentment that these groups have towards white people is bad, And I don't think that anyone should pay for the crime of an ancestor, but I also think that we should understand that this resentment has a source.
Now to give some closing thoughts. There may be some who say that monuments aren't important or aren't worth fighting for, but they are. Monuments are part of a people's understanding of themselves. They tie present generations to the past in a unique way. If these symbols weren't important, they wouldn't be under threat of removal. And while we should do what we can to protect these symbols, we should not allow those that are removed to break our spirit. Instead, it should be the fire that makes us work even harder. I'll now read an excerpt from a speech that truly encapsulates why Confederate monuments were built and why they should continue to stand.
To conclude, I want to say that the Confederate States of America was a nation based on slavery with multiple evidence to support it. That's super obvious. But people like PaxTube, in their conservative minds, are willing to defend these kinds of actions, with excuses like states' rights as a mask for their own racism. These people must and will face resistance to their speech, because for professional scholars, the Civil War was ultimately simply about slavery. It's possible that some PaxTube simps come to this video and bomb the comments with idiotic things, or even denounce this video or something like that. At the very least they will say, "You debunked nothing," ignoring my sources as usual with those fanatics. In any case I'll probably let them to do that, because every comment and every PaxTube simp coming here helps to the growing of the views and it's a perfect signal to find brain-dead people. With nothing more to say, I sign off by wishing whoever is reading this a good day.